The scanner beeped 3 times and then went quiet. Dr. Vren stared at the screen for a long moment. She did not move. She did not blink. Her 4 pale gray eyes were locked on the data in front of her like it had personally insulted her. She had been a xenobiologist for 41 years. She had studied the biology of over 200 sapient species. She had written papers that changed the way the Interstellar Medical Consortium understood life itself. She had won awards. She had been invited to speak at 11 different planetary governments. She had never once in her long and careful career seen a scan result that made her feel stupid. Until now, she called her assistant over without looking away from the screen. Kale came quickly. He was young, a Dravati fresh out of the Consortium Academy. Smooth, pale skin, large black eyes, and the kind of excitement that only very new scientists still carry around with them. He leaned in and looked at the screen. He also went quiet after a moment. He said very carefully that he was not sure he understood what he was looking at. Vren said that was the problem. She did not understand it either. They were on Research Station Theta 9, a large medical and science facility that floated in slow orbit around a massive green gas giant in the Keth Nebula. The station had 17 labs, 2 hospitals, a genetics archive, and a staff of 412 scientists from 30 different species. It was one of the most advanced research stations in the known galaxy, and it had just received its first human visitors. The humans had arrived 2 days ago. As part of a diplomatic health exchange program, 3 human delegates and 1 military liaison officer had come aboard to share biological data and begin what the consortium hoped would be a long and productive scientific relationship with this strange new species from a small blue planet called Earth. The military liaison was a young male human named Marcus Dade. He was not a scientist. He was a soldier assigned to make sure the visit went smoothly. He was calm and friendly and smiled easily, and he had already learned the names of 6 different alien staff members on the station, which impressed everyone because most species took weeks to bother. On his first morning aboard, he had walked into the medical bay for his standard arrival health scan, eaten a small meal from his own food pack, and gone back to his quarters to sleep. The scan was supposed to take 20 minutes and produce a standard biological profile. It had now been 40 hours since that scan, and Vren had not left the lab. The problem was the hair, not in a simple way. The scan had picked up the obvious things. First, humans were warm-blooded, carbon-based, bilaterally symmetrical, and breathed an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. None of that was shocking. The consortium already had basic data on human biology from early contact records. But the hair was something else entirely. Vren pulled up the detailed follicle analysis on the second screen and forced herself to go through it slowly again. The human called Marcus had what his own species called a receding hairline, meaning the hair on the front of his head was thinning and pulling back. He was 28 years old, which by human lifespan standards was very young, but the thinning was genetic, the scan said. Not caused by illness, not caused by environmental damage, just genes, a natural program process that was apparently completely normal and caused no health problems whatsoever. That alone had taken Vren 2 hours to accept. But then there was the rest of it. Human hair was made of a dead protein called keratin. The follicle at the root was alive, but the strand itself was dead tissue that kept growing out of a living body continuously for years without stopping. It grew at different rates on different parts of the body. The hair on the head grew fastest. Some humans let it grow for years until it was longer than their own arms. The hair on the face grew differently from the hair on the body. The hair under the arms was different again. Each area had its own growth pattern, its own texture, its own response to hormones and temperature, and diet, and the variation between individuals. Vren had pulled the basic records on human hair diversity from the early contact files, and the numbers had made her sit down slowly and stare at the wall for a while. One single human species had more hair variety than 40 other sapient species combined. Straight hair, curly hair, coiled hair, wavy hair so tightly coiled it grew upward. Hair so straight it felt like water hair that was black, white, red, brown, blonde, gray, and every combination of those shades, and the texture and the color and the thickness could all be completely different on the same individual at different times in their life, because human hair also changed with age and stress and hormones and nutrition. It reacted to emotion. Stress could cause it to fall out. Hormonal changes could change its texture. Illness could change its color. Fear could make it stand up on the skin. They called that last one goosebumps, and Cale had spent 20 minutes reading about it with the expression of someone watching a building slowly fall over. None of it made sense in a clean biological framework. None of it pointed to one clear evolutionary purpose. No other known species had anything like it. Vren called a full team meeting that evening. She stood at the front of Lab 7 with her data pulled up on the large display and 14 of her best researchers sitting in front of her. She told them what she had found. She showed them the scans she walked them through. The follicle data, the genetic mapping, the variation records. When she finished, the room was quiet for a while. Then D'Arcella, the lead geneticist, raised one long thin arm and asked in a careful voice if it was possible the scanner was broken. Vren said she had run the scan 4 times on 4 different machines. Someone else asked if maybe humans had a special relationship with their hair that served a social or communication function, like the color-changing skin of the Veth or the sound-producing crests of the Harani. Vren said that was actually part of the problem, because yes, humans did use hair for social signaling. They styled it, they cut it, they dyed it. They treated it with chemical products. They spent enormous amounts of time and money on it, but the hair itself was dead tissue. It could not feel anything. It could not respond in real time. It just sat there being dead, and yet somehow an entire cultural industry had grown up around it. The room went quiet again, Vren said. They needed to talk to the human, not to the diplomats. The diplomats were here to talk about treaty frameworks and data sharing agreements. They were busy and formal and would give careful, practiced answers. She wanted to talk to the soldier, the one called Marcus Dade. He had walked in calm and relaxed and unimpressed and eaten his lunch like he did not know he was the most biologically confusing person anyone on the station had ever scanned. He would give real answers. Cale was sent to find him. He came back 20 minutes later and said that Marcus was in the station recreation area. He was sitting in a chair. He was reading something on a small device, and he had taken off his uniform jacket and was sitting in a short-sleeved shirt, and every scientist in the room could see from the security feed on the wall screen that the hair on his arms was doing something. It was standing up slightly. The temperature in the recreation area had been set a little low. Goosebumps. 4 of the researchers leaned forward at the same time. Vren straightened her coat and said they would begin the interview in the morning. She looked at the security feed one more time at this ordinary young human sitting in a chair reading a book, with his dead protein filaments standing up in the cold air. Completely unaware that he had broken the brains of 14 of the most qualified scientists in the known galaxy, she allowed herself one small thought. This was going to be a very long study. Marcus walked into Lab 7 at exactly the time they had asked him to come. He was wearing his full uniform now, jacket, boots, the small badge on his chest that said his name and rank. He had a cup of something hot in his hand that he had made in the station kitchen after spending 10 minutes figuring out how to use the alien coffee machine, which he was quietly proud of. He looked around the room. There were 6 scientists sitting at a curved table. There were 2 scanning machines against the wall. There was a large screen behind the scientists that was already full of data. There were smaller screens on the table, each one in front of a different researcher. Each screen had questions on it. Many questions. Marcus took a slow sip from his cup and said, "Good morning." Vren told him good morning and asked him to sit down. She introduced herself and the 5 other researchers. She explained that this was a formal biological interview and that everything he said would be recorded for scientific study. She asked if he was comfortable with that. Marcus said sure and sat down and put his cup on the table. Vren said the interview would take approximately 2 hours. It took 3 days, not because Marcus was difficult. He was the opposite of difficult. He answered every single question. They had to stop him sometimes because his answers created new questions faster than the researchers could write them down, and the sessions kept running long because nobody wanted to be the one to say stop. We need to think about this. On the first day they asked about his hair loss. Vren explained gently that the scan had shown early pattern baldness and she wanted to understand the cause. She spoke carefully, the way she would speak to a patient about a serious condition. Marcus looked at her and then looked at his cup and said, "Oh yeah, that." He said his dad was completely bald by 30 and he figured he would probably follow the same road. He shrugged and drank his kefir and asked him to confirm that the hair loss was not the result of illness or injury or environmental exposure. Marcus said, no, he said it was just genes. His dad had it. His grandfather on his dad's side had it, pretty normal stuff, the researcher sitting second from the left, whose name was Dr. Pell and who specialized in stress biology, put down his stylus very carefully and asked in a quiet voice if the hair loss caused him pain or distress or affected any of his biological functions. Marcus thought about it and said, not really. He said it was a little annoying sometimes. He said his hairline had started going back when he was 22 and his friends had teased him a bit, but mostly he did not think about it. Dr. Pell wrote something on his screen. His handwriting was shaky. On the afternoon of the first day Vren asked about hairstyling, she pulled up the images she had found in the early contact databases, images of humans with different hairstyles across different cultures and time periods. She laid them out on the large screen and asked Marcus to explain what he was looking at. Marcus leaned forward and looked at the screen, and his face did something that the researchers would later describe in their notes as relaxed recognition. He started talking. He explained cutting and trimming. He explained dyeing. He explained that humans use chemical products to change the texture of their hair to make curly hair straight or straight hair curly. He explained braiding and the cultural importance of certain braid patterns in certain human communities. He explained that men in some cultures shave their heads completely for spiritual reasons or military reasons or just personal preference. He explained that some people grew their hair for years and years as a sign of identity or belief. Dr. Scylla, the head geneticist, slowly raised her hand and asked what Marcus said, why what Scylla said, why did humans do all of that to something that was already dead? Why spend so much effort on dead tissue? Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it for almost a full minute, and then said he had no idea. He said it just felt important. He said humans had always done it. He said it was kind of like asking why people hang pictures on walls. The walls do not need the pictures, but the pictures still matter. The 6 scientists looked at each other. On the second day, things became more complicated. A researcher named Dr. Oren, who studied genetics, asked Marcus for his family hair history. Marcus laughed a little and said that was a very specific request, but sure. He pulled out his personal datapad and started talking. His mother had thick dark hair that she wore natural and had never dyed in her life. His father was completely bald and had been since before Marcus was born. His paternal grandfather had also been bald very early, but his paternal grandmother had full silver hair into her 80s. His maternal grandmother had gone gray at 40. His maternal grandfather had curly red hair that turned white. His older sister had hair exactly like their mother. His younger brother had already started losing hair at 20, which was even earlier than Marcus. Dr. Oren was typing so fast his fingers were a blur. Marcus looked at the typing and said, was this information actually useful? Dr. Oren said this was the most useful thing anyone had told him in 11 years of research. Marcus drank his coffee. On the afternoon of the second day, Marcus showed them pictures from his personal device, pictures of family gatherings, birthday celebrations, holidays. There were people in those pictures with every kind of hair imaginable, an aunt with locks that fell past her waist, an uncle with a shaved head and a thick beard, a cousin with tight natural coils, a grandmother with long straight white hair, a teenage niece who had dyed her hair bright blue. The researchers looked at the pictures in silence for a long time. Dr. Scylla said very quietly that the diversity in a single human family was greater than the diversity in her entire species. Marcus said Realisila said her people, the Dravati, had been the same smooth, hairless species for 6 million years. There was no variation, no individual difference in that feature, none. Marcus looked at her for a moment and said that sounded peaceful in a way. Zilla looked at him like the word peaceful had not occurred to her before in that context. On the third day, Vren brought up the thing she had been saving. She told Marcus that his scan had shown something interesting in his genetic data. The pattern of his hair loss matched not his father directly, but his paternal grandfather. Almost exactly the generation in between. His own father had the same genetic markers, but they had expressed differently. It was a skipping inheritance pattern, something rare and complex and biologically fascinating. She said it with the energy of someone sharing a major discovery. Marcus looked at her and said, yeah, he knew. Vren stopped. Marcus said his dad had told him when he was about 16. He had said, "Son, you are going to go bald like your granddad," and Marcus had said, "Great, thanks, Dad, that is very helpful information." Vren sat back in her chair. She asked how his father had known that. Marcus said his dad had just noticed it was the family pattern. Everyone could see it if they looked. He said his dad was not a scientist, he was a mechanic, he had just paid attention. Vren looked down at her notes. She had spent 3 days running genetic analysis to find a pattern that a mechanic in Detroit had spotted by looking at family photos. She wrote something down. She wrote it slowly, then she looked up at Marcus and said she would need a genetic sample and a full documented family history, and if possible she would like to speak with his father. Marcus finished his coffee, put the cup down, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said okay, but that he was warning her now as Dad was a Vren said she had studied 200 species, she could handle one human. Father Marcus looked at her with an expression that was kind and patient and just slightly like he knew something she did know. Picked up his datapad and started dialing. The holocall connected at 7 in the morning station time, which meant it was late evening back in Detroit. The screen lit up and Gerald Dade appeared. He was sitting in what looked like a living room. There was a worn brown couch behind him and a lamp with a slightly bent shade and a shelf of old books and engine manuals along the wall. He was wearing a gray shirt and he had a pair of reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was completely bald, the skin on top of his head caught the lamplight, and his face was warm and lined with years, and he had the most magnificent thick gray beard that any of the researchers had ever seen on any species. It curled slightly at the ends, and he had clearly been taking good care of it. Looked at the screen and his eyes went wide for just a second, and then he smiled. He said, "Hey, Marcus," and then he looked at the alien faces around his son and said, "Well, hello there." Marcus said, "Hi, Dad," and then explained briefly that these were the doctors on the station and they had some questions about human biology and specifically about hair and specifically about the family. Gerald looked at the researchers with open and easy curiosity. He said, "Sure thing." He said he would help however he asked if anyone wanted him to make coffee first. Nobody on the station knew what to say to that. Vren introduced herself formally and thanked him for his time. She said they would be asking some specific questions and she hoped he would answer as honestly as possible. Gerald said that was the only way he knew how to answer things. The Vren asked about the onset of his own hair loss. Gerald leaned back and thought for a second and said it had started around 26. He had noticed the top getting thin first, and by 30 it was gone completely. He said it did not bother him much. He had seen it coming because of his grandfather. Vren asked him to elaborate. Gerald said his grandfather on his father's side had been bald very early, younger than Gerald. Even he said the story in the family was that the man had lost most of his hair by 25 and just shaved the rest off one morning and never thought about it again. He said it skipped his own father completely. His father had a full head of dark hair all his life right up until he died at 70. The genetics researcher Dr. Oren made a sound that was not quite a word. Vren asked Gerald if he had been aware that Marcus was likely to follow the same pattern as the grandfather rather than the father. Gerald said of course. He said he had watched the boy his whole life. He said he had seen it in the hairline when Marcus was maybe 15 or 16, just a certain look, a certain way the hair sat at the temples. He had taken the boy aside and told him straight. He said he did not want Marcus to be surprised later on when it happened. Vren wrote this down carefully. She asked how Gerald had known it was not common medical knowledge. It was a complex genetic pattern that had taken her research team 3 days and advanced scanning equipment to confirm. Gerald looked at the camera with a kind of comfortable patience and said he had just looked. He said, "You pay attention to your family. You notice things." He said no scanner needed. Dr. Oren put his face in his hands, not in distress, but in the way of a man who had just realized something both wonderful and humbling. Then Vren asked about the beard. She asked because it was scientifically relevant. She said the scan data showed that Gerald had significant facial hair growth despite complete scalp hair loss, and she wanted to understand if there was a biological or practical reason for it. Gerald reached up and touched his beard with obvious affection. He said the honest answer was that he had grown it after he lost the hair on top. He said it was something to work with. He said a man liked to have something. There was a pause of about 4 seconds across the research peninsula. Asked quietly if the beard served a thermal function. Did it keep him warm? Was there a survival purpose? Gerald looked at the camera and said in the absolute nicest possible way that no, it did not keep him warm any more than a hat would, he said. He just liked the way it looked. He said his wife had liked it too. She had always called it his best feature. The room on the station was very quiet after that. Marcus was looking at the table. Vren noticed it and filed it away. She moved the questions forward. She asked about other family members, their hair types, their patterns. Gerald talked for 45 minutes without stopping, and he did not need to be prompted. He talked about his sister who had thick natural hair that she wore in big loose coils and had never once in 60 years cut it shorter than her shoulders. He talked about his brother whose hair had gone completely white when he was 19 from the stress of losing their mother in the same year he was sitting his college exams. He said it happened in about 4 months. The boy went from dark hair to white hair before he graduated, and it never changed back. Dr. Pell, the stress biology researcher, gripped the edge of the table. Gerald talked about his daughter-in-law Marcus's mother, whose hair was so strong and dense that she had broken 2 combs a year for most of her adult life. He talked about cousins with hair so dry it needed oil treatments and cousins with hair so oily it needed washing every day. He talked about a great aunt who had kept her hair completely natural and undyed, and it had stayed jet black until she was 91 years old, which the whole family considered a personal victory. By the time Gerald finished, the researchers had filled more data than they had collected in the entire 3-day interview with Marcus. Then Gerald leaned forward a little and looked at the screen and said he had a question of his own. Vren said, of course. Gerald asked if any of the aliens in the room had hair. Some shook their heads, some showed smooth skin, some gestured to their various biological features that were clearly not hair. Gerald nodded slowly. He looked at each face on the screen with genuine interest and a kind of quiet respect. He said so they had all grown up without it, without the barbershops and the bad hair days and the comb and the grease and the whole thing. Several researchers nodded. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He stroked his beard. Once he said that must be very simple. He did not say it like simple was good or bad. He just said it like he was really thinking about what that life would look like. Vren found that she did not have an answer for him. Then Gerald looked at Marcus and said, "Hey, I almost forgot." He said he had talked to Marcus's uncle Darnell last week, and Darnell had mentioned that his son, the one who was 23, had also started losing hair already. He said it looked like it was coming in on the same side of the head that Marcus had started with. Marcus said, "Great, thanks, Dad." Gerald said he was just keeping him informed. Then Gerald looked at the screen one more time at all the alien faces and the equipment and the screens full of data, and he smiled. He said he was glad he could help. He said they should not be strangers. He said if they had more questions they could call again. He liked talking to new people. He said he hoped they figured out whatever they were looking for. Then he looked right into the camera and said one more thing. He said they had spent all this time studying hair. They had equipment and scanners and teams of scientists, and they had called him a retired mechanic in Detroit to explain something that his family had just known by looking at each other for 3 generations. He said he was not making fun of them. He said science was important. He said he respected it, but he said sometimes the answer is just right there in front of you. If you love the person enough to pay attention. Then he said goodnight and the screen went dark. The lab was completely silent. Marcus was still looking at the table. His jaw was tight in a way that was not sadness exactly, but was something close to it. The way a person looks when something hits them that they were not ready for. Vren looked at her notes. She looked at the dark screen. She looked at the data on all the monitors, the 3 days of interviews, the genetic maps, the follicle analysis, the family trees, all of it, confirmed by a bald man in a gray shirt who had just been paying attention. She said quietly to no one in particular that she needed to write a very different kind of paper than the one she had planned. Nobody in the room disagreed. Vren spent 11 days writing the paper. She did not sleep much during those 11 days. She kept going back to the data and finding new things in it, and each new thing she found made her rewrite a section. She sent drafts to Cale, and he sent them back with notes, and she rewrote again. She sat in lab 7 with cups of cold tea around her and the station outside, her window turning slowly in the dark, and she wrote and rewrote until she was satisfied. The title was Simple Chaotic Follicular Variants in Homo sapiens, a case study in purposeless biological complexity. She submitted it to the Interstellar Medical Consortium Central Research Archive on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, it had been read by more researchers than any paper she had published in 20 years. By the following Monday, the station communication system was overloaded with incoming messages. Vren had expected interest. She had not expected this. The messages came from everywhere, from genetics labs on Drevith, from evolutionary biology departments on Keth Prime, from a professor on the third moon of Heron who had apparently stayed awake for 30 hours straight reading the paper and wanted to ask 17 follow-up questions, from a medical university that wanted to send a team from 2 separate research stations that wanted to start their own human hair studies, from a journalist at the Consortium Science Journal who said this was the most significant xenobiology paper published in the last decade. Vren read every message. She answered each one carefully and briefly. She was not used to this kind of attention, and she found it slightly uncomfortable, but she understood why the paper had landed the way it did. She had not just reported data. She had reported something that challenged a very basic assumption that almost every species in the known galaxy shared. The assumption was this: complex biology serves a purpose. If something is complicated, there is a reason for the complication. Evolution does not waste energy on systems that do nothing. Nature builds what is needed and removes what is not. That was the foundation of xenobiology. That was the foundation of all biology. Human hair broke that assumption completely in the paper. Vren had laid it out clearly. Human hair was one of the most complex, variable, and individually distinct biological features ever recorded in any sapient species. It responded to genetics, hormones, stress, age, diet, and environment. It varied more between individual humans than entire species varied from each other. It had its own growth cycles, its own pigmentation systems, its own structural proteins that differed across populations, and it did almost nothing. It provided minimal thermal protection. A hat did better. It provided minimal sun protection, a small amount. It had trace functions in scent distribution and touch sensitivity, neither of which was significant enough to explain the enormous biological investment the human body made in maintaining it, and yet humans who lost it completely, like Gerald Dade, lived full, healthy, normal lives with no disadvantage at evolutionary terms. A feature that complex, that variable, and that apparently optional should not exist. It should have been reduced or removed over millions of years of natural selection, but it had not been, and not only had it not been removed, but humans had built an entire global culture around it: salons, products, treatments, traditions. The paper estimated conservatively that the human hair care industry represented hundreds of billions of units of economic activity annually, surrounding a biological structure that was at its most basic level dead tissue. The paper called this the most fascinating example of purposeless biological complexity in recorded science. That phrase was the one everyone kept quoting Marcus. Read the paper 3 days after it was published. He read it slowly in his quarters with a slightly complicated expression. He did not love the word purposeless, but he kept reading. He got to the section about the economic industry and made a small noise. He got to the genetic inheritance section and read it twice. He got to the part where Vren referenced the conversation with his father without using Gerald's name, just calling him a non-specialist, civilian informant with multi-generational observational data. And Marcus sat back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he went to find Vren, found her in the lab surrounded by the messages she was still answering. He sat across from her and said the paper was very thorough. Vren said, "Thank you." Said the part about purposeless was a bit harsh. Vren looked at him and said it was the accurate scientific term. She said from a strictly biological framework she could not assign a clear survival function to the level of complexity observed. Marcus said fair enough. He said he understood the science. He was not arguing. He just said that when humans saw that word attached to something they cared about, it felt like being told something about their lives was a waste. Vren was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had not thought about it from that angle. Marcus shrugged and said it was not a big deal. He said the paper was still impressive and that his dad would probably love it once someone translated it for him. Vren said she had actually been thinking about that. She said the paper had generated so much interest that the consortium was planning to formally request a larger human delegation for further study, not just 1 or 2 people, but a real diverse group of individuals with different Backgrounds, different ages, different hair types, she said the research they had done so far with Marcus. And the call with his father was extraordinary, but it was still only 2 data points. She needed more. Marcus looked at her. He said how many more? Vren said 12 would be a good starting number. Marcus said 12 humans on an alien research station. For a hair study, Vren said yes. Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds. He said his commanding officer was going to have a very specific reaction to that request. Vren said she had already drafted the formal request to Earth Command. She had sent it that morning. Marcus blinked. He said she had already sent it. Vren said she had. Yes, she said time was important. The research window was open and she did not want to wait. She said she hoped that was not a problem. Marcus looked at this alien scientist who had submitted a paper that broke the internet of the known galaxy and had already started organizing a follow-up study before the first one was even fully processed, and he realized something. He said aloud that she kind of reminded him of his dad. Vren looked up from her work and said, in what way? Marcus said Gerald also did things first and explained them later. He said the man had once rebuilt an entire car engine in his sister's driveway without asking anyone and presented it as a gift at Christmas. He said the family had had a lot of feelings about it, but the car ran perfectly. Vren considered this and said she would take that as a compliment. Marcus said he meant it as one. He stood up to leave and then stopped at the door. He turned around and said one more thing. He said that when the delegation came, whoever was on it, Vren should let them talk. He said not just answer questions, but actually talk. Let them say what their hair meant to them personally, not just the biology. Vren asked what Marcus said because his dad had told him something once. He said Gerald had told him that the best way to understand a person was not to study them, it was to listen to them. He said there was a difference then. He left. Vren sat in the quiet lab. For a while, after he was gone, she looked at the screen full of messages from scientists across the galaxy, all of them excited about data and scans and genetic mapping. She thought about the difference between studying and listening. She pulled up a new document. She started writing notes for the follow-up study, but this time she wrote at the top of the page in large letters one instruction for herself and for her whole team. She wrote, let them talk first. Then she went back to answering her messages outside the station window. The gas giant turned green and slow in the dark, and somewhere on a small blue planet, an old man with a magnificent beard sat in his living room, completely unaware that his phone call had just changed the direction of xenobiological science. They arrived on a Wednesday. 12 humans walked off the shuttle and into the docking bay of station. Theta 9 and the research team that had come to greet them stood very still for a moment, not because the humans were frightening. They were not frightening at all. They were smiling and looking around and carrying bags, and one of them, a short older woman, was already asking where the bathroom was. The research team stood still because of the hair. Vren had known intellectually what to expect. She had read the data, she had seen the pictures, she had done her research, but seeing it in person was different. There was a tall young man with locks that fell past his shoulders. Each lock was thick and carefully maintained, and they moved when he walked. There was a middle-aged woman with a large, natural halo of tight coils that surrounded her face like something between a crown and a cloud. There was an elderly woman whose hair was pure white and cut very short and neat. There was a man in his 40s who was completely bald and had a beard, not as grand as Gerald's, but respectable. There was a teenage girl who had dyed the ends of her hair a deep shade of blue. There was a man with straight black hair pulled back simply, and a woman with loose auburn waves, and a young woman with hair so tightly coiled it grew upward and outward rather than down. 12 humans, 12 completely different head scale, leaned close to Vren and said quietly that the diversity was even more striking in person. Vren said yes. She straightened herself and went forward to welcome them. Marcus was with them. He had come back on the shuttle as the liaison again. He caught Vren's eye across the docking bay and gave her a small nod that meant be patient with them. They are tired from the trip. Vren nodded back that she understood. The first 3 days were structured interviews, much the same as with Marcus. Scans, questions, family histories, genetic samples. It all went into the database, and the data that came back was extraordinary. It confirmed everything the first study had found and expanded it in directions Vren had not expected. But on the 4th day, something changed. It started with the elderly woman. Her name was Ruth. She was 73 years old, and she had come on the trip because her granddaughter had signed her up, and she had decided Why not? She had never expected to be on an alien space station at 73, but she had also never expected a lot of things that had happened in her life, so she was used to. Superzezvren was conducting a standard interview with Ruth about her hair history. When had it turned white? When had she started wearing it short? Was there a family pattern? Ruth answered the questions, but then she stopped in the middle of an answer and said, "Do you want to know the real story?" Vren said yes. Ruth said her hair had been dark brown her whole life. Not black, not light brown, a warm dark brown that her mother had always said matched her eyes. She had worn it long for most of her adult life, long and natural, and she had been proud of it. Then her husband had died. He had been sick for 2 years, and she had looked after him every day of those 2 years, and when he finally went, she had looked in the mirror the morning after his funeral, and her hair had started coming in white at the roots, not slowly, the way it normally happened in aging, but fast in patches. In the months that followed, it came in white all over until the brown was gone, and there was nothing left but white. She had cut it short herself one morning. About 6 months after he passed, she had stood in her bathroom with scissors and just cut it. She had not gone to a salon. She had done it herself. She had not cried while she did it. She had just felt like the long dark hair belonged to a version of her that did not exist anymore, and the short white hair was who she was now. She said she had never explained that to anyone outside her family before. She did not know why she was telling an alien scientist. She supposed it did not matter. She supposed some things were just true, and it helped to say them out loud to someone who was really listening. Vren did not write anything down during that story. She had been writing notes constantly for 4 days, every session, every answer, every data point documented. Her pen had barely stopped during Ruth's story. Her pen was on the table, and she was just listening. After Ruth left the room, Kao asked Vren if she was all right. Vren said she was fine. She picked up her pen. She looked at her notes. She did not write anything for a long time. Over the next week, each of the 12 humans told her something. The young man with the lokes told her he had started growing them at 17 as a connection to his heritage. His grandmother had worn her hair the same way, and she had taught him how to maintain them herself before she died. He said every loke was something she had touched, and he was not ready to cut them. He said he did not know if he would ever be ready. The teenage girl with the blue ends told Vren that she had dyed her hair for the first time at 14, right after her parents had separated. She said everything at home felt like it was out of her control, and her hair was the one thing that was hers. She said she changed the color every few months, not because she was unhappy, but because it reminded her that she could change. She had the power to do that. At least the bald man with the beard said he had shaved his head on the day he enlisted in the military. He said it was partly regulation but partly personal. He said he had wanted to feel like he was starting something new, something serious. He had grown the beard after he came home from his last deployment. He said the beard was the part that meant he was back, he was done, he was home. The woman with the natural coils said she had spent most of her 20s straightening her hair because she worked in a professional environment, and she had been told quietly, without anyone ever saying it directly, that her natural hair was not appropriate. She had started wearing it natural at 32, and the first day she had walked into work with her hair as it was, her hands had been shaking. She said she was not shaking from cold. Vren listened to all of it. She did not study them in those moments. She just listened on the last evening before the delegation was due to leave. Marcus found Vren sitting alone in Lab 7 with the lights low. The screens were off. The room was quiet. She had a cup of cold tea she had forgotten to drink, and she was looking at nothing in particular. Marcus sat across from her. He asked how she was. Vren said she had made an error in her first paper. Marcus waited. She said she had called human hair purposeless. She said the word had been accurate from a strictly biological survival framework. She still believed that to be true in terms of thermal protection and physical function, but she said she had been wrong about the word purposeless. She said she had spent 14 days listening to 12 people talk about their hair, and in every single story the hair was not about the hair, it was about a husband they missed. It was about a grandmother who had taught them something. It was about a day they had decided to stop being afraid. It was about a morning they had looked in the mirror and decided to become someone new. She said human hair was a record not of biology, not of genetics. Those things were in the hair, yes, and they were real and they were important, but the record she meant was something else. She said human hair held the shape of everything a person had been through it, changed when they changed it marked the years it held. The grief and the joy and the decisions and the losses and the way it grew and the way it fell and the way they chose to wear it or cut it or color it or grow it long enough to reach the past. She said it was not purposeless at all. She said it was the most purposeful thing she had ever studied. She just had not had the right equipment to understand it at. First Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He said that was a good way to put it. Vren said she was going to write an addendum to the paper. She was going to add everything she had learned in these 14 days, not just the data, but the stories. She was going to put them in there with the names changed for privacy, and she was going to say clearly that she had been wrong about the word and why. Marcus said his dad was going to, like Fat Vren said she wanted to call Gerald again when the addendum was done. She wanted to read him the new section. She wanted to tell him that he had been right. The answer had been right there. She had just needed to love the subject enough to pay attention. Marcus was quiet. Then he said she could call him any time. He said Gerald would probably talk for an hour and offer her coffee and ask about her family and somehow end the conversation knowing everything about her while she barely learned anything new about him. He said that was just how his dad was. Vren smiled. It was small, but it was real. She said she looked forward to it. The delegation left the next morning. The docking bay was busy and loud, and there were goodbyes and handshakes and the kind of warmth that builds between people who have shared something honest. Together, Ruth hugged Cale, which surprised him so much he stood with his arms out for 3 full seconds before he figured out what to do with them. Marcus was last to board. He paused at the ramp and looked back at Vreshe. Was standing at the edge of the bay, watching them go. Her research team was behind her, 14 scientists who had spent weeks measuring and scanning and mapping and then listening. Marcus said he would see her at the follow-up study. Vren said she was already writing the proposal. He laughed and went up the ramp, and the door closed, and the shuttle pulled away. Vren stood there until it was gone. Then she went back to the lab and sat down and opened a new document and began to write. She wrote for 6 hours without stopping. Outside the station window, the gas giant turned slow and green in the endless dark. Far away on a small blue planet, an old man with a magnificent beard was sitting in his living room watching television. He did not know that a scientist 4 light years away had just decided to rewrite the most celebrated paper in xenobiology because of a phone call he had made from his couch. He did not know that 14 alien researchers were going to read his daughter-in-law's name in a scientific journal and understand for the first time that hair was not biology, it was memory. He did not know any of that. He was just sitting there being Gerald, being exactly enough.